Hello, church history friends. I'm Wendy Eaton, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening as we gather around to hear the tale of RLDS Apostle James E. Kelley. But before we dive into church history, let's take a quick look at some of the latest happenings here at the Historic Sites Foundation. We are down to our last two lectures in our four-part lecture series. Here's a look at the past and present. Our two previous programs, Your Story is Church History with Janae Grover and Seth Bryant's lecture on Isaac Sheen, are now available for your viewing pleasure. Peter will drop a link in the chat that will lead you to our full catalog of past lectures, where you will find recordings for both Janae's and Seth's programs. While looking ahead to tonight, Barb will share the story of RLDS Apostle James Kelley, while our last Thursday, we will sit down with Kristen Mackay to hear the history behind the auditorium, the historic Green Dome in Independence, Missouri. Peter's dropping a link to the series page where you can register for the remaining lecture if you haven't already. Thanks, Peter. As Barb shared last week, we are launching into our annual campaign for funding the Alma Blair Internship Program. As a former summer intern, I highly recommend the continuation of this life-changing program, especially this year as we are continuing to expand those internship opportunities at the Graceland University F.M. Smith Library and Archives, at Liberty Hall, the Kirtland Historic Properties, the Oral History Program, and two interns in the church archives here in Independence, Missouri. Our board of directors is so committed to supporting this internship program and extending those opportunities for growth that the board has offered a $17,000 matching gift. That's right, donations you give this evening will be doubled up to $17,000. That's amazing. As you can see on the screen, there are a number of ways you can give to support the spring campaign, whether in an online donation or by mail. I like to think that when you give to the Blair program, you're making an investment in the future leaders, historians, curators, and storytellers. Thank you for your consideration and for helping preserve both Alma Blair's enduring legacy and church heritage through your support. Helping me behind the scenes this evening is Peter Smith. Peter is a board member for Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and a co-host of our annual church history tours. Welcome, Peter. It's good to have you back for another round of church history lectures this spring. Our guest storyteller this evening is our own Barb Walden, a familiar face here at Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, where she has served as the executive director for over 16 years. Barb also serves as a faculty associate at Graceland University Community of Christ Seminary and team lead of the Community of Christ Church History and Sacred Story team. Welcome, Barb. I'll hand the microphone over to you for as long as you'd like to share.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Peter. I am really excited about sharing the story of James Kelley tonight, but more specifically talking about his journals, the journals that were donated from Ann Gould. Now, with every bit of history, there's always a backstory. And so before I launch into the presentation, I want to share the backstory of the journals. It was in February of 2011. I was attending the Arizona Winter Reunion. The Arizona Mission Center used to offer a winter reunion in late February every year, and it was a fantastic reunion to attend. People would gather from all over the country, many of them snowbirds, staying in Arizona for the colder months of the year. And we would all gather to the Phoenix Central congregation for a week of classes and worship and fellowship and lots of food. And rather than meeting at a reunion ground where you would stay overnight and spend long days together, the winter reunion in Arizona was at the Phoenix congregation and only lasted from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. So people would commute into the congregation and spend time together in class and fellowship and worship. But at 4 o'clock every day, those in attendance would bolt out of the sanctuary on their way to their homes or their hotels or wherever they were staying because the focus was to avoid rush hour traffic in Phoenix. I've never been to a reunion where people scurried out of class or scurried out of worship as fast as they did at the Arizona reunion, winter reunion. But if you've ever experienced Phoenix rush hour traffic, you would understand why people were hitting the parking lot at 4 o'clock and on their way home. Well, if you were a guest minister or a guest educator at this winter reunion, with everybody fleeing the congregation at 4 o'clock, that meant you had the evening all to yourself. I attended this reunion regularly for several years, teaching church history classes. And each time I went to the reunion, I had the joy of staying with Ann Gould. My mother would often travel over from Southern California and stay with Ann and I. And sometimes Glenna Van Buskirk from Stillwater, Oklahoma, would stay with Ann as well. So at the end of the days, we'd all gathered at Ann's house, and it would be an evening of, well, multiple evenings of laughter and stories and just plain old good times. Anne is just a fantastic person with contagious positive energy, and you can't help but soak all of that in when you're staying at her house. Well, it was during that February 2011 winter reunion that Glenna and my mother and I and Anne were all gathered together in Anne's living room. And I was sitting at the piano. It was Anne's mother's piano, Dorothy Prawl Kelley. And I was playing some of the old hymns in a little game of Name This Hymn. As you see, I have a wild nightlife during Winter Reunion, and we were having a good time. I was playing the hymns, they would name them, but eventually these stories would come out of the hymns. So once that hymn was named, somebody had a story, or that hymn reminded them of that a particular story or time in life. And so it was just a night of sharing tales or spinning tales. And I don't know what hymn it was, but something prompted a memory from Anne in thinking about all of this history that she had, family history, that was being stored there at her house that she wasn't sure what to do with. That her children and her grandchildren weren't really interested in family history, and she certainly didn't want to throw it away, but she just wasn't sure what to do with it. So, as a history lover myself, I began to inquire, well, what is it that you have? And what family members is it connected to? And she had shared that much of it was related to her grandfather, who was a missionary in the church. In RLDS history or Community of Christ history. So then I began to ask, well, who was your grandfather and what areas of the church did he travel to as a missionary? Well, she mentioned that his name was James Kelley and that he had traveled all over the United States on his mission and that he had recorded many of his experiences in a series of journals. And she had these journals and letters. And I was very much intrigued. That's probably an understatement. The name Kelley is a legacy family name within Community of Christ history. But I hadn't heard of James Kelley and I wanted to learn a little bit more. Anne answered a number of questions, but then said, you know, I have the journals, I have the material here. Do you want to take a look at it? Well, yes, of course I do. She says it's upstairs, and she rose and started to climb the stairs. And of course, I was hot on her tail, climbing those stairs right there with her into her room on the upper level of her home. She walked into that craft room, swung open the closet doors, and far back in this closet, she reached, pulled out a Yonkers box, a paper box from the Yonkers department store. Maybe some of you remember the Yonkers store. Well, she took that box back downstairs into the dining room and began emptying out the material. And it was incredible. These old journals and letters and Herald articles and photographs. It was incredible. And I'm going to share just a little bit, a few of the items that were on that table. And she began sharing what some of these items were and just uncovering all of this incredible history of James Kelley. And my history nerd heart was just leaping out of my chest. This was incredible. The history in that Yonkers box included family history, but also the story of James Kelley, Anne's grandfather. He was the youngest member of the Quorum of 12 at the turn of the 20th century. He was a missionary that sacrificed his health and family, traveling as far northeast as Maine and as far southwest as California and Arizona. He crossed the prairie states, the Ohio farmland, hiked from one home to the next throughout the Rocky Mountain Mission. His life, within these journals and letters, as you begin consuming them, you discover that his life portrays a simple missionary in the reorganization, struggling to survive on mission while simultaneously providing for his family back home. It was a struggle, and Kelley poured his heart into his writings. He detailed his missionary adventures and church planting experience in the early 20th century. He also added rich international history as he wrote of trudging through the wet jungles of the Philippines as a U.S. soldier during the Spanish-American War. The Yonkers box preserved the tragic story of this young RLDS apostle, full of life and passion, who also struggled with the weight of ministerial pressure and a debilitating illness of tuberculosis that eventually took his life. I was up all hours of the night consuming this material, the letters that were there, the journals, flipping through them, the Herald articles, and why were these certain articles saved? The incredible news is that Anne generously donated the historic material to the Community of Christ Archives in 2011. And Mark Shear was the church historian and archivist at that time, and he received this generous donation. He also recruited 2 volunteers to help preserve what was donated. Larry Martin read the journals page by page, recording the content into audio files, while Marcia Brown transcribed all of those audio files. You also had Ron Romig and Joe Stauffer involved in the transcription as well, specifically his years in the Spanish-American War. These were hours and hours of audio files, and the material made it just in time for James Kelley to be included in Mark Shear's 2nd volume of church history. So what exactly was included in this big donation? Well, here, 5 journals covering his experience in the Spanish-American War, his missionary travels across the United States, and autobiographical summaries of pivotal moments in his life. Many of these are reflections of his looking back and uncovering lessons learned and meaning in some of these memories. There were 22 letters that were preserved in Anne's safekeeping. Many of the letters were James writing to his mother, Nancy, or writing to his wife, Audentia. Some were written during his military service while he was in the Philippines. What's interesting is that his brother is also serving in a war around the same time in the Boer War, and he unfortunately lost his life. So with that context, reading some of these letters, and especially the letters that Nancy is writing to her son, or the responses he's giving to her letters, include a lot of depth and emotion. There was a Bible that was given to James by a church member in San Francisco before he departed for the Spanish-American War. Also featured here, the final hospital bill that was sent to his wife, Audentia, after James passed away. Now, James Kelley, I mentioned, was the youngest member of the Quorum of 12 at the turn of the 20th century and son of the late apostle William Kelley. He was a missionary that you'll find through his journals sacrificed his health, sacrificed his family, traveling all over the United States. His life portrays that simple missionary in the reorganization, portrays that struggle, and portrays the sacrifice that families are making during this time. Well, James was born in Madison, Indiana on June 11th, 1879. I mentioned that his father, William Kelley, was an apostle at the time of James's birth. His father later became president of the Quorum of 12 and remained so until 1913 when James was brought into the quorum. He served for 40 years. That is, William served for 40 years. Here is an image taken around the time William was called into the 12. That collage of images. You can see Joseph Smith III in the middle with Jason Briggs above. And then going clockwise, you see Alexander Hale Smith, E.C. Briggs, William Kelley, Joseph Lambert, Zenas Gurley, and to round it out, John Lake. William was kind of a big deal in the early reorganization, very much involved in the leadership of the reorganization and the mission of the reorganization, side by side with Joseph Smith III and other apostles. Well, the family relocates to Kirtland, Ohio, a few years after James's birth in 1885. But they weren't the only Kelleys heading to Kirtland in the 1880s. You can see here is the Kirtland Hotel. The Kirtland Hotel no longer stands. It unfortunately, much of it burned down and the rest was tore down in the 1930s. The Community of Christ Chapel is located where the Kirtland Hotel was once located. As you look at that photo, you can see to the far right, there is a structure just beyond the tree. That's the Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon home that is also located across the street from the Kirtland Temple. The Kelley families lived in the hotel, managed the hotel, and it was a place where people stayed when they attended general conferences at the Kirtland Temple or as they were passing through town. A number of church members stayed in the Kirtland Hotel either overnight or for long periods of time, like the Kelley families. For a brief period of time, the E.L. Kelley family lived in the Sidney Rigdon house next door. Speaking of which, the E in James E. Kelley stands for Edmund, and he was likely named after his uncle Edmund Kelley. Not only was James's parents, William and Nancy, heavily involved in the church, his uncle Edmund, or E.L. Kelley, William's brother, served as presiding bishop of the church. E.L. and his wife Catherine, who you can see here, known as Cassie, moved to Kirtland a few years before James's family. The Kelleys were heavily involved in restoration efforts on the Kirtland Temple. And while William and E.L. traveled around the church raising funds for preservation efforts on Kirtland's historic House of the Lord, it was James's mother Nancy and his aunt Cassie who managed the Kirtland Hotel where they lived. They made meals for traveling missionaries and at times unofficially managed the ministerial needs of the community. Even more interesting, James's aunt Cassie was giving tours of the Kirtland Temple, managing bookstore sales, and acted as the temple caretaker while E.L. and William Kelley were away on church business. There's even accounts of her fielding questions from reporters and being interviewed by reporters about the reorganization during this period. And her letters to her brother-in-law William and her husband E.L. during this time really highlight an active congregation and a busy home life for James's family. They include a lot of detail, and these letters were preserved and are now cared for in the Community of Christ archives in Independence. So in addition to preserving the Kirtland Temple, his uncle and father were traveling to upstate New York to record accounts from people who knew the Smith family during the Palmyra period. They're traveling to Pennsylvania to record interviews with the Rigdon family. They're traveling to Missouri to record interviews with David Whitmer and some of the Whitmer family. Mind you, much of this documentation also included a pro-RLDS agenda, but at least we have written accounts from people who witnessed church history as it was happening. E.L. Kelley was instrumental in acquiring the printer's manuscript for the Book of Mormon and a number of other artifacts from the Whitmer family around the turn of the century, as well as involved in saving Graceland during a time of heavy debt for the church when he was serving as the presiding bishop. James's uncle and father were RLDS rock stars, to say the least. So James, growing up in this environment, in Kirtland, which is becoming a new gathering place for church members as they're gathering back to Kirtland, purchasing property, living in homes surrounding the Kirtland Temple. The community is growing in size, and it's members of his family who are leading this community, leading this congregation. A lot of expectations were put on James's shoulders, even at a young age, as a member of the Kelley family. Back to the 1880s Kirtland. In addition to fundraising and overseeing the maintenance and restoration of the Kirtland Temple, the Kelley family also witnessed the return of all of these saints to Kirtland in 1883 when the church hosted a general conference in the Kirtland Temple that April. This was the first general conference held in the temple since the late 1830s. So, over the next decade, there is a resurgence of church members gathering to Kirtland and increasing the size of this area. Kirtland becomes a flagship congregation during this period. Several general conferences were held here over the next 30 years as restoration efforts continue on the historic house of worship. I should mention, you recall that in 1880, there's a lawsuit involved in the ownership of the temple. Well, it was E.L. Kelley, who was the church lawyer, arguing the case for the RLDS to have clear ownership of the temple. That's in 1880, and that really kicks off this restoration effort in that decade. Now, it's here in Kirtland also that James is baptized by his uncle in 1896. He then attends Graceland University. At the time, it was Graceland College for 2 years and was there in Lamoni during the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. He was caught up in this nationalist fervor during this time, like many young men his age, and he felt the urge to enlist. He enlisted on May 11th, 1898, and was mustered into the U.S. Army on May 30th, 1898, just a few days shy of his 19th birthday. He joined the 51st Iowa Volunteers and was sent to the Philippines. Well, Kelley made his way from Iowa to San Francisco, where he spent a few days with church members. One of the treasures donated by Anne was that Bible that James received from a church member in San Francisco before boarding the Pennsylvania for Manila in November of 1998. The Pennsylvania stopped off in Hawaii for a brief period of time where James connected with church members. Charles Waller, who you see here, a prominent church member, met him shortly after the ship arrived in Honolulu. He spent quite a bit of time with the Waller family, getting the Hawaiian culinary and cultural experience. He spent time at the Waller home in Waikiki and explored Waikiki Beach and Diamond Head with his host. Years later, Waller would be known as the father of the church in Hawaii. He was quite prominent for a number of decades. Kelley's second day on land included attending the local RLDS congregation, where he noted that the congregation was mainly Native Hawaiians, with a Waller family and one of Waller's nephews being the only light-skinned people in attendance. It was Gilbert Waller that introduces him to a number of Native Hawaiians and really blows Kelley's Midwest mind with his cultural experience here in Hawaii. He notes in his diary, the natives are very smart, deep-thinking people to what I thought they were. Very nice, hospitable, and pleasant. Well, he soon departs Honolulu, headed for Manila. And his journal describes not only his arrival, but daily encounters and experiences that he has there in the Philippines, a vastly different experience from some of the areas where he grew up. And I'm going to show a number of accounts from the journals that talk about his experience in the Philippines. Wednesday, December 7th. Again, this is 1898. Dropped anchor in Manila Bay at 11. It is a very large and very beautiful bay. Water as smooth as a lake, a grand sight, sailing into the bay. Past a battleship or two, native towns, about 10 transports lying here in the harbor at anchor. July 3rd, 1899. Stood watch with morgue last night. Everything was quiet until about 4:30 when quite a number of shots were discharged. Awful foggy and looked for an attack. Mosquitoes awful. Almost dead for sleep. It is so hard on one's eyes, and the mosquitoes won't let us sleep. Our head nets are a blessing. Adge Davidson left the regiment yesterday. He is detailed. A fine officer. Don't see how we will get along without him. Lieutenant Bennett is acting adjutant. July 11. Heard last night that we were to be relieved this week. Disagreeable all night, still soaking wet when we came off duty this morning. Boys can't stand this long. 7 went on the sick book after they came in. I am well. Had a wrestle with Parker today. I throwed him. Mail came in. I did not get a letter. July 19th. Still raining hard. People back home never saw it rain. Water is running like a river right out in the open fields. Streams that were 4 feet across are now a half-mile wide. In fact, the whole country is a lake. Water is halfway to our knees, or can't make it out. Wringing wet when I got in. Took all the forenoon to clean my gun and dry my clothes. River is so high it flooded the cook shack, and we had to move it over across the road into a sugar warehouse. Pulled in the right post yesterday. The sentry to stand in 2 feet of water. July 27th. The duty was fairly easy. I'm not feeling the best this morning. When I came, I found Reed nearly flat on his back. He feels awful bad. I feel better this afternoon. McCoy and McLaughlin went to the hospital with some others this morning. We have 16 in the hospital and 32 on duty. The whole regiment is nearly wore completely out. Frank is shipping this afternoon, having filled up on quinine. As you'll read in Mark Shear's Volume 2, there is an account of Kelley shooting a Spanish soldier during this time. The Spanish soldier he said the Spanish soldier wasn't listening to the guards as he approached, and he was shot. There's an account of it in the journal, but there's no other accounts that I could find of Kelley reflecting on this experience, of him talking about this experience. He didn't write home about it to his mother during this time. It's one of those events I would really like to learn more about. Surely it had an impact on his life, but one that he just didn't talk about. Well, as he returned from war, or while he was away at war, his family relocated from Kirtland to Lamoni, Iowa, where they remained for decades. And at 21 years old, in July of 1901, Kelley was called to the office of elder and ordained in the Kirtland Temple by his father and A.H. Parsons. In his journal, he recalled the first sermon he preached was from the Melchizedek pulpits in the lower court of the Kirtland Temple, which you see here on the screen. He said that he chose charity as his text and said, quote, "It was very hard to get up the first time before old boyhood friends and faces," end quote. I can imagine it was nerve-wracking to be preaching from the historic pulpits of the Kirtland Temple, but to also be preaching to your old high school friends must have really been an experience. Well, Kelley volunteered for missionary service the following year and was assigned to labor in Maine and throughout the New England states. Then his assignments turned westward. In 1903, he was appointed to Ohio, and in 1904, it was the Rocky Mountain Mission. While he was in Ohio, he writes to the Saints Herald about missionary success along the beaches of Lake Erie and planting a church in a GAR hall in Nina, Ohio. As a young adult, he especially enjoyed returning to Kirtland, and in Columbus, Ohio, he writes, quote, "Had the pleasure of becoming acquainted with some new saints to us and earnest workers. It encourages us boys to meet others near our own age who love the work," end quote. He's quick to acknowledge that any success he has in the field is due to the efforts and daily example of the people living in the area who, quote, "continue to liberally assist with talent, means, and time," end quote. James's experience in the field also led him to want to go back to school. The church released him from his missionary assignments to follow in his uncle E.L. Kelley's footsteps to pursue a degree in law. James enrolled at the University of Iowa, where he attended for 18 months, but he withdrew because of his poor health. As you probably noted from those accounts in the Philippines, he becomes very sick in the Philippines. He came down with malaria and a heavy case of pneumonia. Some suspect it's there that he caught tuberculosis. Not sure, but what he did pick up lingered with him much of his life. And throughout his missionary experience, you see flare-ups taking place, and a lot of suffering happening during this time. So as he's pursuing this degree in law, you can see there is a flare-up that happens that results in him having to pull out of school because of poor health. Doctors recommend for him a drier climate, and he was assigned to Arizona for treatment. Within a year or two, he was pronounced cured. I wish I could find more information about this period in James's life. I suspect he's living with or near an aunt of his in the Arizona area, but I don't know for sure. After his health rebounds, he returns to Lamoni and to his original career in ministry, just like his father. And during this time, as the son of William Kelley, as the nephew of E.L. Kelley, he is carrying, it feels like the weight of the world, as he talks about in his journals, a lot of pressure. There's expectations on him because he's a Kelley. They're expecting him to follow in the footsteps of the generation before, to take on assignments, travel assignments, sacrificing time and health. Well, since he was choosing to return to the missionary field, at once he convinced his girlfriend, Audentia Hayer, who you see here with her family, he convinces her to marry him sooner than they had originally planned. They surprised their friends on October 25th, 1907, with their wedding. The two were married in the parlor of Audentia parents' home. Officiating that wedding was Albert A. Smith. Audentia Hare, like Audentia Smith, was often called Audie by her friends and family. Anne Gould shared that Audie's dress, her wedding dress, was one shared among the women in her family and was eventually donated to Liberty Hall. Honeymoon? Well, these two, shortly after being married at her parents' home, they headed for a honeymoon, but it wasn't the honeymoon you'd think. It was a missionary assignment to Cheyenne County, Nebraska. Talk about romance. Well, after 2 months of marriage, James left Audie by herself in Nebraska while he set out on another missionary trip. This was all too common for missionary wives during this time. The men would travel the countryside, sending funds back as they could, but it was rarely much. The missionaries were often relying on the generosity of others to provide for themselves, for their housing, for their food, for what they needed, and whatever was in excess, they would send back home. It was a struggle for both the missionaries and their families. And it appears that Audentia returns to Lamoni often during James's absence, likely for the support of family. Well, fortunately, James was home and able to be there for Audie at the birth of their firstborn child, James Lorenzo, born in August of 1908. Lorenzo was blessed by Joseph Smith III and William Kelley, who would have been Lorenzo's grandfather. He was also blessed along with John Garver's daughter, Verna, being blessed that same day, which was a family connection. And over the next 5 years, two additional children were born to James and Audie. Robert Maxwell was born in 1910, and Gretchen Audentia was born in 1930. Here is Audentia with Robert Maxwell. Robert is Anne's father. The same year, James and Audie's first child was born. James was ordained a 70 at the 1907 General Conference by John Rushton and his father, William Kelley. He joined the Third Quorum of 70 and was assigned the western part of the United States. And in 1909, he was at a reunion in Manitoba and reported to the Herald about his experience there. Additional assignments included western Nebraska, Manitoba, and in 1912, Arizona and New Mexico. The assignments in Arizona and New Mexico were mainly influenced by his weakening health during this time. And it's during this time that the family relocates with him to Naco, Arizona, because of his health. They stayed in furnished rooms with Mrs. Brown, who was a church member. They lived three in one room in what they described as an old shack in Naco. He did newspaper work for added income and relied on his pension to survive, but still had to borrow money to return to travel throughout the Southwest field. And it was in Arizona when he learned that his father was seriously injured by a streetcar in San Francisco. He said, quote, "The hardest thing of the year was to remain idle and stand the insinuation of the saints that I was not as interested in them and the work as I should be." This is a reoccurring theme that you find in his journals and letters. It's when he's trying to take care of himself, he's feeling a level of guilt in doing that, feeling as though this is selfish of him to rest and care for himself. But he's also feeling an added amount of pressure from church members to be out there practicing his calling as a missionary and as 70, to be ministering to people. And he was often in this dualistic place where what is the priority, to care for others or to care for himself? And this particular quote, and I'll read it again, "The hardest thing of the year was to remain idle and stand the insinuation of the saints that I was not as interested in them and the work as I should be." Well, despite his struggling health, in 1913, James is called to the Quorum of 12. He's called the same year that his father retires from the Quorum of 12. As I mentioned, William Kelley had served for over 40 years, and during that time, he was the president of the Quorum of 12 for 16 of those years. So as he's stepping down and James is stepping up, you can see the pressure that's happening. This was happening throughout the church, where, Joseph Smith III is having his son Frederick Madison Smith become the next president. You're seeing younger generations stepping into the positions that their fathers or their uncles were holding. There were these legacy families, and the Kelleys were certainly a part of that. So as he is taking on this new position as an apostle, it's also taking on the expectations that he would fulfill the legacy that his father had set down as well. He journals the details of the experience of his calling to the office of apostle. And this is a long quote, so hold on to your hats and stay with me. It's such a great quote. I didn't know what to cut out, so I'm giving it to you in its entirety. It's happening at the Old Brick Church, which you see here in Lamoni, Iowa. And he says, the night before it was given to the quorums, meaning the revelation calling him to the office of apostle, he says, Audie and I were sitting in the rear of the assembly room of the church in the middle section near the northish when Hale Smith came by and, laughing, made a remark of inference as to my being connected with the revelation and that there really was one. He said a second time, I should be ready and scared. I laughed it off to him, but it worried me way into the night. He continues, the next morning, as I went to meet with the 70s in the basement of the church, John Garver walked to the corner by Steffens with me. As I bid him goodbye, he said, quote, I am not responsible for what people tell me, but I can say to you that you are in need to prepare to receive something when you go in there, end quote, meaning to hear the revelation read. And such a strange feeling, a feeling of awe, of responsibility, of inefficiency, of unworthiness, of awfulness, came with the hearing of my name read. Only God knows how it affected me. I did not cry. I did not feel like it. Tears could not have brought relief from the extraordinary, though not altogether unpleasant condition. I don't suppose my facial expressions changed much, if any. The big changes were inside. I prayed a little. I wonder if it were possible. I thought of Father, of his many years of service and what he would think of it all, and of what it meant to Audie and the boys. As soon as advisable, I left the assembly in company with Brother Ayler. We walked a little. I told him of my spiritual impressions of him a few years before in a conference assembly, that he was superior in mentality of those about him and would likely one day be in the 12. We went into the last of the prayer meeting. Here, sitting side by side with Brother Ayler, the tears began to come, my heart to swell, my mind to open to the magnitude of what it all meant, what it did and would call for, what it meant to wife and family, the load I should have to carry, the high mark of service set by my father's years of service that I would be expected to live up to, if not excel, and my poor health and little wisdom and learning to put into the labor to be performed. Only one who passes through can know the honor of it all in the church, and before men I thought not of, but I did. I do now, and I hope I always shall, appreciate the fact that God, our God, had recognized me and my feeble efforts of the past. The place in this that buried all else saved the added sacrifices I knew it would call for in this life. He's overwhelmed. And it's on that day he was ordained an apostle under the hands of Gomer T. Griffiths, F.A. Smith, and John Rushton. The ordination was held in the basement of the Brick Church in Lamoni. And as I mentioned before, his ordination and his father's farewell as the president of the apostles was the same day. When he watched his father hand the gavel over to the new quorum president, Gomer Griffith, and walk out of the room after 40 years of ministry on the council, it was a very emotional experience for James. James walked home that afternoon to tell his wife about the revelation and ordination, and reality was sinking in as the day went along. And I think it was on that long walk he realizes that he's got to explain all of this to Audie and more or less share what she's in for. I imagine there was a mixture of dread as he walked home. It's not a long walk. It's less than a block from the brick church to their home on North Silver. But I imagine that day it was a long walk for James. When he arrived home, he found her sitting by the big window in the dining room. He shared the news about the events that had taken place that day and what it all meant for the family. He wrote that she cried and said the words, quote, "Never mind, Jim dear. We will do our best, and I'll help you all I can. God won't leave us alone," end quote. And he writes, "What a wonderful helpmate for a man to have who is called to such a peculiar work. She said she saw me coming up the walk and knew that something extraordinary for me had happened. What a good wife she is." James was sent to the Pacific Slope Mission after conference, leaving Audie behind with her family there in Lamoni. Housing was too expensive in Arizona to bring her along, so he felt hopeful for California. He would send for Audie and the family once he had a firm plan for housing. He writes to the Saints Herald from Iuka, Kansas during the summer of 1913 about a debate between an RLDS missionary and the Church of Christ that had been finally called off at 11:45 p.m. on the 12th night of the debate. It was an exciting debate that included defending anything from the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith Jr. to the Pentecost and whether or not Judas fell from his office. The letter to the editor shows that missionaries were putting up tents wherever they could find footing to host worship services and to share in fellowship. James traveled from California into Arizona, struggling with his health along the way. He's detailing a lot of it in his letters and his journals. He's also attending and participating in debates, prayer meetings, and business meetings, continuing to push himself. He writes that he visited a joyous congregation as well as divided ones. He was often called on to resolve conflicts, to officiate over business meetings, and to assist in ordinations. He worked as a Graceland recruiter and counselor at times. He observes a healing miracle with a woman suffering from paralysis, as well as jealousy between members of the Quorum of 12 over, quote, "who's biggest," is what they argued about. at some point. He speaks of his own ignorance as a young apostle, having to rely most heavily on the Lord's Spirit in decision making. Over and over, you can see his vulnerabilities in the journals and in the letters, his feeling of insecurity during this time. And again, I think that the pressure of living up to the expectations of his father and his uncle played a role in this. In San Bernardino, California, he presided over a business meeting where two priesthood members were running for the office of branch president. The congregation voted, and it was a tie. They voted again, and it was a tie. Finally, Kelley had to cast the deciding vote. The election was followed by a branch business meeting and finally an elders court meeting where 8 cases were brought to the court. So this is heavy work that he's doing on these travels. He accepted donations to provide for his travel expenses and for his family. His health is a roller coaster ride. Some days full of energy and the spirit, other days completely exhausted and stressed that he was not living up to the expectations of an apostle, of the church members that he came in contact with. Here's one quote. So worn, I could not think. My nerves getting in a very bad state. I was looking for a word from Audie every day that she had been delivered of her child. Here he is in 1912. In Phoenix, he retreated to a rented room by himself to rest rather than staying at a church member's house. And just as a quick comparison, here he is in a healthy state versus where he is in 1912. And this picture in 1912 is even before he became an apostle. Another quote. I was coughing and raising much, spitting color, and felt I must have rest and light air if I could get it. Coming here to Phoenix, I did not go to the home of any of the saints or even Aunt Mary Putnam's. I just wanted to be alone and rest. The soreness seems to be leaving, but I spit color and raise much yet at times. It gets to be a pretty long, lonesome blue fight at times. Surely could never stand it if the Lord did not cheer and comfort. And Audie and the babies are a big help. And the confidence of the church, it seems to be reaching my right lung too now. As he is nearly broke, he recognizes that he must contact his aunt, a local church member, for a place to stay. And he's really resistant to leave the solace of a hotel room where his only focus is to care for himself, to then move in with a church member, even though that member is a member of the family. There's that added pressure that comes with it. And that's really described in this next line when he says, then the saints will soon be after me, and I'll have little rest. In 1916, Fred M. Smith, the president of the church at the time, and F.M. Sheehy made immediate plans to move Kelley to New Mexico for his health. He was in Colorado at the time when they make this decision. They also provided funds to reunite him with his family, and it was hoped by his removal to New Mexico that his life might be prolonged. But the stress of passing over the Continental Divide provided too much for his weakened body. His last report to the General Conference shared the progress being made in the field and the young people who were engaging in the work. He ends the report with, quote, while my individual labors have been small because of physical limitations, they have been more than the year previous. The Lord has guided and blessed me in the same in such a way that faith and hope have been enlarged, my love of God and my fellows made to grow, while my soul is filled with thanksgiving and my prayers increased for the early success of Christ's work. End quote. Well, unfortunately, James passed away on a summer afternoon in June at a hospital in Las Vegas, New Mexico, on Monday, June 3rd, 1917, at 2 p.m., to be exact. He was 38 years old. Fortunately, he was with his wife, Audie, and their children at the time. His sister Ethel, who was a nurse, was also there by his side. His body was taken to Kansas City, where a short service was held at Union Station Chapel for relatives and friends on Tuesday, June 4th. His body was then taken through St. Joseph, Missouri, and on up to Lamoni, Iowa, with the funeral party. A service was held at the Brick Church in Lamoni that Friday in June. His uncles E.L. and Uncle Cassius Kelley were in attendance. And to just think, this is only 4 years after he was ordained an apostle in that very same church. Well, today, James Kelley is resting with his wife Audie at his side in the historic Rose Hill Cemetery in Lamoni, Iowa. James left behind a wife and 3 young children when he passed. Audentia was widowed at 32 years old. There were 3 young children. Their 3 young children were James Lorenzo, 8 years old, Robert Maxwell, 7 years old, and their daughter Gretchen Audentia was 3 years old during this time. Now, Audie lives her remaining years in Lamoni. Her parents and siblings give her support in addition to a pension she received from her husband that helps support her young family. Audentia helped found the Lamoni Public Library and served as the librarian for a time. She passed away in 1973 at the age of 89 years old and is buried, as I mentioned, at the Rose Hill Cemetery, along with James and all 3 of their children. Here you can see her with her sisters late in life, along with her famous cranberry relish recipe that was published in November 1934 in the Lamoni Chronicle. So, friends, that is all I have to share about James Kelley. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Barb.
Are there any last things, Barb? Anything you might have thought I skipped over that and want to throw that in if I have a last chance?
No, I've shared with you everything I know about James Kelley. I just want to thank Ann Gould once again for her generosity in donating all of this historic material to the Community of Christ archives. And for those listening, if you have missionary journals from an ancestor or materials that you're wondering what to do with, please contact me. Contact the archivist for Community of Christ, Rachel Killebrew. Your story is church history, is something we say over and over again, and it's true. Your family's history is Community of Christ history, and I imagine there's a lot of treasures out there. So thank you all for listening to James Kelley's life and legacy.
Well, our evening has flown by, and I'm sorry that it's time to draw our time together to a close. Thank you, Barb, for sharing and serving as our guest historian tonight and for sharing this story behind James Kelley. Also, a big thank you to Peter for helping out behind the scenes and for continuing to make it look so easy. We also want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us tonight and for your support of the internship fundraising campaign this year. Now's your chance to double your donation. We are especially grateful for your continuing interest in church history and a love of a good story. We couldn't host programs like tonight without your support. Thank you so very much. We hope you'll join us next Thursday for our final lecture in the spring series. Our friend Kristen Mackay will share the fascinating story behind the Community of Christ Auditorium in Independence, Missouri. This historic domed structure is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, and Kristen will be highlighting its centennial history for us next week. Peter has already dropped the link in the chat where you can be among the first to register for next Thursday's program. So thanks again for joining us this evening. Until next time, keep reading your church history and take care, friends.